Hi, I'm Greg. I'm the lead singer for Lipstick Generation. And today on the Lipstick panel, we're doing something a little bit different. And by we, I mean me, because Steve is out of town, and we have a few backlogged episodes, trying to stay ahead of the curve, but Steve's going to be out of town a lot over the course of the next couple months. We have those backlog episodes, but I thought with the year ending, I thought it might be fun to do a year retrospective. But we're a list show. We do rankings on this show, and I thought, what can I do by myself, without Steve, without any other guests? What could I rank of my own that is encompassing of 2019? And I realized I saw a bunch of movies this year. I'm not really a film guy. I'm more of a book guy than a film guy in general. But this is one of those weird years where I saw more movies than books I've read. I think I read about 10 books this year, and I saw 19 movies. Now, I'm not counting the film that I did the score for. I did a film score this year for an upcoming feature called The 13th Cross, directed by Joseph DeGolier, who's been a guest on our show a couple of times. He's from Ultima Final Fantasy and the Godzilla podcast. So that ate up about 3 months of my year. We have released a bunch of Game of Thrones related singles this year, so that was 6 songs in that project, and a cover of Eric Carr's Eyes of Love, so 7 new Lipstick Generation songs, and then about 3 hours worth of film score for the 13th Cross. So there was a lot of music made by me this year. So it was a fun year, a lot of fun things going on this year. But I thought, you know what? I've saw all these movies, so I'm going to go through the films that I saw this year and rank them from least best to best, and just give you some general thoughts on them. Obviously, going to be a very, very loose show, very laid back. I am going to include Game of Thrones Season 8 as a movie, just because of how high the production quality was, and I thought it would be fun to compare that with other films that came out this year. I know it's not really a film, but I don't watch much TV, and so I thought, you know what, I'll just stick it in there just so you can see how highly or low I thought of the finale of Game of Thrones. So I'm going to go through my list from the bottom to the top of films that I saw this year and just general thoughts on them. These are films that came out this year, commercially released in the United States. So I'm not counting like films that were new to me that didn't come out this year. So if it was like, oh, I saw this Harry Potter movie I hadn't seen, I'm not counting it. It has to have come out this year. So, at the bottom of my list is a film called Blinded by the Light. This was a film I had high hopes for, and it really let me down. For those who don't know the film, it's a semi-autobiographical film about this writer from England whose parents are Pakistani immigrants, and he is just super into Bruce Springsteen. So he's just an obsessive Bruce Springsteen fan. He's, kind of angsty about school and just, is like an awkward teenager and is looking for direction. And then he discovers the music of Bruce Springsteen, and, that's just the movie. The premise is good. The premise is this kid who is, angsty, listens to the music of Bruce Springsteen, and the music of Bruce Springsteen, awakens something in his soul. And Bruce's lyrics about feeling out of luck and downtrodden, and, the anthems for the poor working class, misunderstood by, parents and society, those themes resonate with the protagonist of the movie. And he just, gets obsessive, and it becomes very, very goofy. And I think there's a disconnect. And I'm a guy who loves goofy musicals, so don't get me wrong, but there's a disconnect with how much, Bruce affects his life. There are legitimate great lyrical lessons from the Bruce Springsteen catalog, and these just seem to, go over his head, and he is just, a crazy, happy, obsessive fan, and he's not really learning lessons from Bruce's music, but more just getting really into it. And I think that's sort of the problem, is that with an artist like Springsteen, who is very, reflective and looks internally, the protagonist of this film is more looking to the external, looking to Bruce, and just thinking Bruce is like a messiah and hero of music, but he ultimately doesn't like really learn that significant of lessons. Ultimately he learns to, respect his family more, and his family learns to respect him more. But it really just like it fails as a film, and it's just like it's way too cheesy, and not in a good way, where it's just like a lot of grown moments. I know the film was critically well received, but it's just I wanted to like this movie. It really failed and dropped the ball in terms of like a good character drama. If it was going for a goofy musical, like it didn't succeed with that either. It's just like they'll just randomly just start quoting Bruce Springsteen lyrics and like kind of breaking into song, but kind of not. It's like it doesn't go full into the extravagant enough to be fun and vibrant. I didn't see Rocket Man, but people have told me that it's basically just like a dream musical. It didn't go that far, but also like it didn't go far enough into the drama either. It just sort of this is a film that's really lacking identity, and it did not work for me. So next up on my list is the live action quote unquote Lion King. It's fine. It's basically the original movie, but with less charisma between the actors. The CG looks really cool, but there's not really that vibrancy and chemistry between the different actors that there was in the original film, and I think that's kind of why it falters. So I think just I don't know, just like it's lacking that spark, that interplay that made the original magical. It's good, it's fine, but it's I don't know. There's just something lacking in the chemistry. There's some great performances. John Oliver is great. James Earl Jones is still fantastic. They had some good ingredients, but I don't know. It just it's fine. It's not bad, but it's fine. So next up on my list is Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, or as I like to call it, Checklist the movie. I realize at the time of this recording, actually by the time this comes out, anyone who wanted to see Rise of Skywalker will have seen it. But spoilers, everything you want to happen in it, happens in it. I kind of found this film to be like really lazy in terms of storytelling. It just felt like it took all. It's just a movie full of cheap fan service without a good story. And as a guy who likes good stories, that kind of bums me out. It's I don't know. It's about the same quality as every other Star Wars film. So if you like Star Wars, you probably find it fine. But it it really was a disappointment in terms of storytelling for me. I'll talk about it more. We're going to be doing a Star Wars ranking episode soon. I don't want to give away too much of my thoughts on it, but it's near the bottom of my list for 2019, so I think that tells you something. Right above that is the Aladdin live-action remake that came out this year. I thought this was a pretty fun movie. Not as good as the original, but it had a lot of distinct charm and had its own personality. I thought all the actors were great. I thought Will Smith was appropriately charming as the genie. I thought the visuals were fantastic, like excellent visual direction for the film. I love that it ended with a Will Smith rap in the credits. The world needs more Will Smith ending credits rap songs. So this is fun, and I like that it was a good balance between telling that familiar story but offering a new twist on it. A lot of people I've talked to prefer this live action Aladdin to The Lion King that came out this year. And I think that's because Aladdin just had more of its own identity. It did things different from the original and added something to it where it's like you might actually get the urge to watch this one. And the one thing I'll say different from a lot of online critics is that I found the Jafar in this film fine. He wasn't mustache twirly as literally the old Jafar in the original was twirling his mustache, but I thought this was still a very fun. Yeah, I thought this was a fun movie. I enjoyed it. Alright, so next up on my list is the Lego Movie 2, the second part. I think of the Lego movies that I've seen, I'm trying to think. I saw the original, I saw Lego Batman, and I saw the Ninjago one. This one is kind of the least memorable of all the Lego movies I've seen. It's fine. I remember it was funnier than Aladdin, and I thought Chris Pratt playing dual leads was very hilarious throughout the movie. But it's less memorable than Aladdin, but I remember enjoying it more while it was on. I don't have too much to say about it, but yeah, it was fine. Alright, so next up on my list, we have Spider Man Far From Home. This was a. Trying to wrap my head around this. I'm not a big fan of the MCU Spider Man because he lacks the pathos and interesting character building of Spider Man in the comics and Spider Man in other film adaptations, and even the Andrew Garfield ones. Just like Peter Parker is not a very interesting character in the MCU. He's just like Spider Boy sidekick, and like doesn't have the angst that I really feel is essential and crucial for the Spider-Man character. That said, I know that there are so many different interpretations of these characters, and you need to just enjoy it for what it is. So I think that the world has room for a dark and angsty Superman. So why not a Spider-Man without any angst? I mean, that is a fair criticism because I've complained like, oh, you can have a dark and angsty Superman, so I should allow for a light and not angsty Spider-Man, but what they replace the angst with just isn't interesting to me. Positives, I mean, obviously, the acting is great in this movie. I think that the chemistry between Peter Parker and MJ in the movie is really good, really believable, so it's a really good high school romance from that perspective. And Jake Gyllenhaal is fantastic as Mysterio. He is so very Jake Gyllenhaal in this movie. And just, a joy to watch. Mysterio's long been a favorite of mine. The visuals are very stunning, very comic book-esque, big, epic. It's a lot of fun. Seeing, the J. Jonah Jameson cameo at the end was really cool. So this was a very fun movie, a very enjoyable movie. The only thing that's lacking for me is just I'm not into the MCU Peter Parker. He just doesn't do it for me as a really compelling, interesting character I can follow. He's fine, and the movies are fun and enjoyable, but I think they're lacking that depth that I typically want from Spider-Man. But for just a lighthearted adventure, it's enjoyable. So next up on my list is Yesterday, which is a film about a guy who gets hit by a truck and gets transported into a parallel universe where the Beatles never existed. The Beatles are my favorite band, as listeners of this podcast know, and yeah, I thought this was a fun movie. Obviously, love the soundtrack because I love the Beatles, but this was a very clever premise that I think was well executed. The idea that a struggling musician who's just a big music aficionado who happens to know a bunch of songs by a bunch of bands wakes up in a universe where the Beatles are no longer a thing. I think that's a very clever premise. It's very fun, and it's answers that that question that people have been debating online, like would the music of the Beatles hold up if they never existed? Would it be successful in 2019? And this movie posits, yes, the music is so good that it would still be, a giant monumental shift in music, and that the person or people who came up with those songs would be hailed as geniuses no matter what decade they came out in. Lots of funny moments in this movie. There's a really hilarious bit where he's Googling to see, what has changed in the world, and Oasis doesn't exist because the Beatles don't exist, so I thought that was very hilarious. He sort of the main character has sort of a songwriting rivalry with Ed Sheeran in the movie, and just like Ed Sheeran, to his credit, plays it off really well. Where just like he views his music as so inferior to the music of the Beatles, and just like has his ego crushed throughout the movie. I think he plays it really well, and the film does have like an endearing romance. It's just great performances all around. Yeah, so this was a very fun movie. I liked it a lot. So next up on my list is, I believe, the only streaming exclusive movie on my list, which is The Dirt, the Motley Crue biopic. I am, I would say I have mixed feelings on Motley Crue overall. I really respect the first two albums quite a bit, and I think the John Corabi '94 album is fantastic. but a lot of the other stuff I'm not super into. So they're a band that has some stuff I love, some stuff I'm just not a fan of, but I'm very familiar with the catalog. I actually like a lot of 6 a.m. stuff better than Motley Crue stuff, but that's a whole other tangent. And also Vince Neil's solo album better than a lot of Motley Crue stuff, but whole other tangent. This movie is a pretty typical biopic, but a little bit more extreme because it's about Motley Crue and how debauched they are. If you're even a casual fan of the band, I think this is it's a good movie about the excesses of rock and roll, and I feel like there's been a lot of talk about this movie coming out in, the wake of the Me Too movement and woke culture. And I think that this movie, and, people complain that this movie glorifies this kind of debauchery. I think this is just an accurate, somewhat accurate representation of what Motley Crue did and were about. There's some liberties taken, as with all biopics, and there's, some humorous stuff thrown in. I would say it's a much funnier movie than you might expect. It has a sort of a witty self-awareness about it. But yeah, I would say it's a very enjoyable movie that if you're a fan of 80s rock, I feel like if you want just a brutally, honest depiction of it, I think The Dirt succeeds with that. I mean, there's, obviously some liberties, but it's just like, hey, did you know that the 80s were debauchery and craziness? It's that in film form, and I don't think it's making a moral judgment either way. I would say it's an entertaining watch, and I think it's more well done than people give it credit for. A lot of people say it's like a made-for-TV movie, but I think it holds up pretty well. Alright, so next up on my list is Shazam. Now, I've been a big fan of the character of Shazam, who I knew as a kid. His name was Captain Marvel to me, and so all the shenanigans with Marvel having a character named Captain Marvel and the character's name being changed to Shazam, but then a lot of people as kids called him Shazam anyway. So to me, he's Captain Marvel. To this film, he's Shazam. To the world, he's Shazam. This is a fun movie that I think gets a lot of things right. I think the villain is great, very menacing, believable character motivations. I think that this film really nailed the essence of the Shazam character, which a lot of the comics don't get, is that what it would be like to be a kid who all of a sudden gets superpowers and can turn into a superhero. A lot of the comics tend to write Shazam as like much more serious and brooding, and really losing that aspect of like this is like a kid, the mind of a preteen, young teenager inside this heroic body. I think a lot of the comic adaptations miss out on that, and I think this film does a really good job of playing with like the whimsy of what it would be like to be a kid with superpowers. I think the character dynamics are great. I think it's well written, well directed, well paced. I think there's a couple awkwardly extremely dark moments in the middle of the film that just like and at the beginning too, we're just like they stand out because like they're so much darker than the rest of the film. It's like, you know what, maybe like this doesn't tonally match, but that's really my only critique of it. Otherwise, it's a very fun ride, and I'm very much looking forward to Black Adam with The Rock, and so he can square up with Shazam. So that's just going to be awesome. But as it stands, this was a very enjoyable movie, and this is one I wish had done a little bit better at the box office, just because I think it is really refreshing and well done. So next up on my list, I've got Pokemon Detective Pikachu. So this one I think is a little bit more flawed of a movie than, let's say, Shazam, The Dirt, or Yesterday, but I just enjoyed this one more. I think, finally seeing a good video game movie is a big part of the appeal, because I think video games, a lot of them have really strong stories contained within them, and I think it's a shame that there hasn't been someone who understands the source material enough, but also understands filmmaking enough to just make a good movie out of a video game. So it's really great that Pokemon Detective Pikachu exists, because they pit a part of the Pokemon property, which is like this semi-obscure side game about a Detective Pikachu, and realized that this was the one they could make into a movie and like tell a good story with. as opposed to just doing the straightforward, like, going off on a quest, being a Pokemon master. They said, what's the best story we can tell with Pokemon? And opted for this. I think Ryan Reynolds as a Detective Pikachu is great. People call him PG Deadpool. That's basically what he is. But he's very funny. The chemistry between him and the lead actor, whose name I am blanking on, Justice Smith. I think they've got a really great chemistry together. It's an endearing movie. I think the Pokemon look visually stunning, and they picked the right artistic choices for most of the Pokemon. Like, when you look at Pikachu, you're like, yes, that is the right choice you can make, where it looks enough like the cartoon and the video game, but also looks believable in this CG world. I think they did a really good job with that, and they also did a good job of making it fit in within the established lore of Pokemon, where nothing really conflicts. From what I know, as a very casual Pokemon fan, nothing really conflicts with things that have already been established in the games. So they made a film that's canon to the universe, but also works as a standalone. So I think it's a very successful film. I think it's very fun. I think if I was a kid, I would have loved this even more. But even as an adult, this holds up pretty well as just as a fun joyride of a movie. So yeah, big thumbs up from me. So next up on the list is Captain Marvel. Now, I don't have any bias against the character other than being a fan of Shazam and just always recognizing that character as Captain Marvel in my head. I'm not one of those guys who's like, oh, it's starring a woman and I need to be angry about it on the internet because Ghostbusters or whatever. Like, I'm not one of those guys. I think, that's toxic and bad. I think this movie just is... Honestly, I like this movie a lot more than I expected, but it's just... How do I put this? It's good, dumb Dragon Ball Z-esque fun, where it is a ridiculous joyride of a movie where I'm barely taking it seriously at all. But for some reason, just the character of Captain Marvel works for me, just like this basically Dragon Ball Z character in the Marvel Universe. It might just be my love of Dragon Ball and loving the ridiculous fight scenes and how overpowered she is. And I think her personality being overpowered works better for me than a Superman being overpowered, because, like, Captain Marvel is just like, whatever, let's get the job done, let's kick ass. Which I think is cool, as opposed to Superman, who's always like, I'm sad that I can't save everybody. Captain Marvel just has more of like a go-get-em attitude, just get the job done. And so, for some reason, like, that character really works for me. And I just found this to be a thoroughly entertaining movie. I thought that Jude Law was great as the villain. I thought the twist with the Skrulls, spoilers, from a film that came out, like, I don't know, March or something. I thought that was a really clever twist, because comics fans were expecting the Skrulls to be, oh, they're the villains, they're always the bad guys. And I think it's ultimately a good thing for, in 2019, Disney / Marvel to say, like, hey, these people who are a different skin tone than you, they might not be all bad. I think that's a good message. I think if they continue to do, like, these people of a different race are bad and you must hate them, is ultimately, more toxic towards the culture. And so I think that was a good twist. And, yeah, I thought this was a great film. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. So, next up on my list is Dragon Ball Super Broly. That's right, I saw this one in theaters. The beginning of this film is so excellent, and the rest of this film is so okay. Like, the first, 30, 40 minutes of this film is just perhaps the best Dragon Ball has ever been, period. It's well paced, it's well directed, there's drama, there's stakes, there's tension, and it does a good job of bringing you into the universe. Even if you had never seen Dragon Ball, you would understand what's going on, the dynamics of everything that's happening. And then when they do the time skip where they jump to present day, it just becomes kind of like a standard Dragon Ball movie, admittedly with great action sequences and really funny character dynamics, especially with Frieza. He is hilarious in this movie, and Frieza is one of my favorite characters. So there's positive stuff in the second half of the movie, or the after the time skip, so the bulk of the movie. But that first chunk of the movie is so good. It's disappointing that the second half is just kind of a standard Dragon Ball movie, because the first half showed how you could make an excellent movie set in this universe, and then they just didn't. But they made the beginning of an excellent movie. So yeah, this ranks high on my list because I'm a big Dragon Ball fan, and even though like other movies that are below this on the list did their movies like as a whole better, that beginning chunk was so excellent. It's enough for it to elevate this high on my list, and it makes me want to rewatch it, and want other Dragon Ball movies in the future to maybe be as good as the first third of this. So, next up on the list is Game of Thrones Season 8. I know it's pretty high on the list. We've only got a few left. Let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things above Game of Thrones Season 8. So yes, technically not a movie, but I think the cinematography and the scale that this series has, I basically count as a movie for this year. I am very satisfied with where the characters ended up, and like everything made sense in terms of foreshadowing. So if you read the novels, or it's pretty obvious that Daenerys is being set up to be a villain basically right from the beginning. If you have any knowledge of history and conquerors, like Daenerys is definitely an evil character throughout all of the books. And the show just sort of sets her up as a protagonist, but she is definitely evil. So it was very nice seeing that come to fruition on the show, because if you're paying attention, like, this was broadcast from a mile away. And I think that Bran sitting on the Iron Throne was a excellent troll ending, which I know is what Martin probably planned, and the writers of the show admittedly did not build up to that at all, and did not accurately answer why Jon they did not accurately answer why Jon would not ascend the throne. They did not answer that at all. And I believe that I'm not sure why they didn't answer that. I'm not sure why they didn't ask George for notes as to why Bran was the one who got the throne instead of Jon. It's definitely very ridiculous that Jon did not get the throne. But because we all knew that Martin said he wanted to have a bittersweet ending, and something that wouldn't be completely satisfying, man, what is less satisfying than Bran being on the Iron Throne? I think this season I was less emotionally attached to it because we were doing that Game of Thrones project, where we wrote a new song about each episode of Game of Thrones and recorded and released it less than 4 hours after the episode aired. And I think because I was just in such a hurry to get the song done, and it was just this fun project of staying up till 2 in the morning and just shoving a song out and being just incredibly tired the next day at work, I think that just made this a really fun experience for me, where I'm just going to have nostalgia for this season, mainly for that dumb musical project we did. There's some flaws with the execution, for sure, but I think the character actions are believable. Daenerys just going crazy and burning King's Landing is believable to me, they set it up that way. The big finale of Jon killing Daenerys is beautiful, in that it's, a Shakespearean tragedy in many ways, but it's also still the classic story of, good guy slays dragon. At the end of the day, Game of Thrones is a really complicated way of saying the hero slays the dragon and saves the kingdom. And I like that that's ultimately what it is at the core of it, around all this, convolution and breaking down of tropes, is ultimately just one giant trope. So, yeah, Game of Thrones Season 8, I enjoyed it for what it was and had fun with it. Yeah, and, I guess the one disappointment I would have is that we all thought that, this was a really unconventional story, and the pieces were moving in all these different directions. We're interested to see how things came together. But ultimately, things did not come together in a very interesting way. Jaime's arc of yep, I came to the north and helped defeat the zombies, and then I just went back and hung out with Cersei. The different moving parts didn't necessarily make for a really complex and interesting ending. It felt very simple. And there's nothing wrong with, a simple story, but because Game of Thrones, the entire show and the novel seem to be based around, how are these different moving parts going to interact? It just felt like the moving parts didn't interact in a way at the end that justified the beginning. Like, we thought that this was going to be a really unconventional story, and we're interested to see like how you could fit all these moving parts together for a finale. And the finale didn't fit them in ways that were very interesting. It felt like a very streamlined, straightforward end of a story. And I don't think that's necessarily the showrunner's fault. I think that's what Martin intends. And so that's, it'll be interesting to see how he executes it. But ultimately, I was fine with it, and I was treating this as like a Cliff Notes abridged version of the ending anyway, like like Disc 2 of Xenogears, one of my favorite games. So season 8, well, they just did the Disc 2 thing. It was fine. All right, well, we are now in my top 5 for the year. And so next up on the list is Western Stars, the Bruce Springsteen film. So this is a concert film where Bruce plays the entire album Western Stars, his new release from this year, plays it live with an orchestra in his barn, and in between each song, vignette, mini-film, where Bruce monologues and there's some cool imagery, and he talks about like the theme of the song you're about to listen to, and it's usually in like a cool, like sort of like spoken word poetry kind of thing. This is a great film. This is a film that inspired me to dig even deeper into Bruce Springsteen, where I was listening to his entire catalog, binging it, because I appeared on a Bruce Springsteen podcast and wanted to refresh myself and check out the stuff I'd missed. I really liked the new album, so I checked out the movie. And he starts monologuing in the movie. And there's a monologue where Bruce is talking about how he's hurt people in his past, and hurt the people closest to him, and had to learn how to be a better person. And, Bruce is... he's in his golden years. Like, he's old. He's, late 60s, early 70s. Like, you don't have to be that brutally honest on film. You can just, like, make your money, retire and be like, everything's great, I'm happy. But he is breaking himself down on screen, acknowledging his faults and how he needs to grow as a person, and has grown, and, like, how he is continuing to try to pick up the broken pieces of his soul and try to do, the best he can day by day. I just found that to be incredibly powerful, profound. We've got this sort of wise sage, old Bruce Springsteen, in his golden years, spitting gospel and telling stories, and it works so well, and it makes you want to check out more of Bruce if you haven't checked out more of his stuff. And it gives you a new dimension to him as a man, as an artist. And, it makes the album, I already liked the album, so it didn't really necessarily make me like it more, but it's an excellent companion piece, and it's the kind of thing where after you see it, you wish that every album you loved had a movie like this, where the artist plays the entire album and has these little vignettes in between to tell you like about the emotional core of the song you're about to listen to. I was surprised with how much I liked it. And it's just, it was a really, really excellent experience. I'm really glad I went to go see it in the theater. It was really awesome. So, next up is Avengers Endgame. I already talked about it pretty at length on the MCU podcast we did, which, I also talked about Captain Marvel and Spider-Man Far From Home on that podcast. So, what I will say about this film is, it's like a greatest hits CD. It's revisiting all the, the past moments from great MCU films, and really tying everything together. It feels like this film got fan service right in that Star Wars Episode 9 did not. Like, they were all things that it felt like everything built up to this. It felt like there was setup and payoff from, previous films. Like, Captain America getting Thor's hammer was set up and paid off in an appropriate moment. The movie did a great job juggling all the different characters, making you care about what happens on screen. A really great job of, even though juggling all the characters, making it the story of Captain America and Iron Man, like they are the core Avengers. And the movie did a great job of juggling all those characters, but still keeping them as like the emotional crux of what's going on. It's just an all-around great film, a great conclusion to the series. I think it's really, really excellent. And, there's a lot of criticism of superhero movies, and a lot of it is valid criticism, but I just think this movie, like, accomplishes so many things, being this, like, a fun time travel heist film, a big, Lord of the Rings X conclusion to an epic saga. I love this film, and I think it is truly excellent and something to be proud of. To have woven all those stories together, and like, is it the greatest story ever told in the history of cinema? No, but it is still a damn good story, told consistently well through the course of many films, and to like six to they got the landing. Like Game of Thrones didn't necessarily stick the landing for everyone. Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, didn't necessarily stick the landing. They were able to stick the landing with this one, and I think that's something to be proud of. And just I don't know how well it stands on its own as a film, but because I'd seen all the other films, it's number 4 on my list for the year. So number 3 on my list is Joker. This is, a film that, I'm trying to think of how to put this. There are a lot of people who are against this film because of some of the people who they think might end up being fans of this film. Like, just before this film came out, I just heard so many people say, like, oh no, this is going to attract the worst kind of fan base. It's going to be like Fight Club and like freaking Scarface. Like, all the worst people are going to like this movie. I think the difference between this Fight Club and Scarface is that this film, I think, actually offers like some interesting philosophical discussions and has themes that are worth examining, and is very much a film for the society we live in 2019. I know we live in a society, but I think this film is really clever in that what it does is they make Arthur Fleck a sympathetic enough character where it makes you really like question we live in a society. It's so hard to talk about this movie without diving into the memes that everyone mocks about it. But it really is an examination of modern society and what happens when a society is cruel to someone and treats them as an outcast, and like what can push a person to be as dark as the Joker. In this, in the same way, like I think it's a frightening film for a lot of people because they see a part of society. Keep saying society. Oh, they see something they don't want to see, which is systemic poverty, lack of access to mental health. They can see like how that can push a person to do bad things, and it does interesting things where like it makes Thomas Wayne, who is normally this big heroic character in the DC universe, they make him into kind of an oligarchical jerk, and it makes you reevaluate everything. And all right, so here's what I'm trying to say. The Joker is clearly the villain. The Joker clearly goes too far. But I think what the film does in making the audience uncomfortable is they give him a couple good points. And I think that's kind of the point of it, is like, we don't want to acknowledge that evil people might sometimes have a couple good points. And they might have a couple motivations for why they took the path they took. And we don't want to look at that. We just want to say, oh, they're evil. We don't want to look at the cause of evil. So if you look at, let's say, turmoil in the Middle East, why does someone hate America? Is it just because we have freedom? No, it's a combination of things, and part of it might be abusing other countries, exploiting their resources and killing innocent civilians. So, we'll bomb a country, take their resources, take their oil, claim it was for the sake of democracy or, some other political reason. And in war, civilians always die. So if you are a citizen of this country and you believe that the United States attacked your people unjustly, killed your family in a raid, you might turn to a life of terrorism to battle the United States. And we don't want to acknowledge blowback. We don't want to acknowledge issues that we may have caused. And that's not to say that I'm not justifying what they're doing. But what I'm saying is you have to acknowledge where the other side is coming from, because otherwise you're just perpetuating the cycle of violence. And I think with Joker, they're acknowledging, like, where those, the crazy people come from. And, if they can't afford their pills because we don't have, universal health care, and they're just like, tough luck, kid, figure it out. if people live in such poverty that they, enter such desperation, like these are good points. And I know a lot of people are saying like, oh, it's just glorifying like the white crazy guy. I don't think that's the point. I don't think it's supposed to glorify. I think it's supposed to show you, how this can happen. And it's supposed to encourage discussion about like what kind of world we have and what kind of society, quote unquote, we have set up. Obviously because it's the Joker, there's a flair for the theatrical. And, there's a lot of controversy about the film because, like, oh, he ends up being, like, the cool villain. I think that's. I would say this film is much more valid than, let's say, Taxi Driver, where just there's not really a message at the end of the film. It's just like he just kind of goes crazy. I think this film does not glorify the Joker as much as, let's say, The Godfather glorifies organized crime. I would say, like all those mob movies out there, all those Scorsese mob movies are much more glorifying of the villains than Joker. I think this is just showing the portrait of a very complex character and does it so well. So I think this is one of the greatest films, one of the greatest comic book films of all time. I think it is incredibly well done. I think this film has its own identity. I know a lot of people just say, oh, it's like Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. Visual homages does not, like, a copycat make. Borrowing, like, the style and aesthetic from something doesn't mean that it's a one-for-one ripoff. I think this film has its own identity, especially in terms of story, where I think it's vastly different than the films that it is, that people claim it's ripping off. And, if you can't do an homage to something, then, Star Wars is a ripoff of just serials from the 40s. I think Star Wars has its own identity separate from those serials. I think Joker has its own identity separate from Scorsese films. So, I would say this is a very strong film. I think it's a very misunderstood film by a lot of people, and I think there's just I think just there's a part of woke culture that wants to attack it because it's about a crazy white person, and I think there's reason to be wary of such works of art, and I think there's reason to I think like there's a valid reason to not want to encourage the crazy white people. Like I get that. There is valid reason to not want to encourage that kind of behavior, but I don't think this film is encouraging it. I think this film is just a portrait, and a very good portrait, and one that's worth examining. So I like the film, and as far as the music thing goes, I have to touch on the Gary Glitter thing. Being a glam rocker and whatnot, I thought that the inclusion of the Gary Glitter song was really really clever and a great artistic choice because Gary Glitter is a charismatic monster. He did terrible things, wore makeup, and was just a bad dude, but still had like this charm and charisma about him. And having that play after Arthur Fleck fully turns into the Joker, I thought was a very clever musical choice because if you know the history of the song, you know what that song is, it really solidifies his descent into pure villainy. And Elephant in the Room, yes, I do acknowledge that I have been in a glam rock band for the past decade and have ultimately failed most of my musical successes. So in the way that Arthur Fleck is a failed stand-up comedian, I am in many ways a failed musician who, who used to dress in brightly colored outfits, kind of like a clown, and wrote a song about a talk show host to try to get the talk show host's attention. So the parallels between my life and this movie trolled me pretty hard. But for the people out there, no, I don't condone violence. I don't condone the actions of the Joker. I just find it amusing that, like, hey, I too dress like a clown and try to get the attention of a talk show host, and didn't. Womp womp. But that aside, I think it's a great movie, and I think it's something that people should give a second look to because I think it is saying something important. I think it's saying something important, and I think that makes it valid to exist. I think that it's not paper thin and just pandering, to the far right extremists. I don't think it's that at all. I think it is a very clever film that is worth examining. So we're at the number 2 film on my list, which is Rambo: Last Blood. So, in comparison to Joker, as I was, saying that Joker was a film about a far right extremist, it actually might be closer to far left extremist in terms of like its statement about poverty in society and mental health in society. But Rambo: Last Blood, a lot of people accuse of being a very racist movie because Rambo is battling the Mexican cartels in this movie. I don't think this movie is racist, says the straight white male on the internet. But here is what I will offer to you about this film. The film, basically the only white character in the film is John Rambo. Everyone else is Latino and of Mexican descent, character-wise. And so all of the good characters are Mexican, as are all of the villains. But the thing is, it's showing that there's different personalities and different kinds of people. I think the female lead in this film is so well written. They give her just an excellent character arc. They really make you care for her, and like you are engaged in what is going on with her almost more so than you are with what's going on with Rambo. And I think because this film has such strong character writing, it gives the film more stakes, where it's much lower intensity than other Rambos in terms of just like the explosions and the carnage, and it's more of a revenge thriller, akin to like the Death Wish movies, closer to Death Wish than Rambo. But because like the writing of the characters is so strong, this is easily my favorite Rambo movie and the biggest surprise of the year for me. Because I'll be honest, I wasn't super into the Rambo series. I thought they were okay to bad action movies, and this film made me reevaluate the entire series, for now I like the rest of the films way better because of this movie. I think that like the characters and the motivations are all very believable. I think it's incredibly well paced, well directed. It gives you like the appropriate amount of gore you want for like a gritty, dirty Rambo action movie. But the thing is, I think this film has heart and has a broken heart within it. They make you care about the characters, and they rip your heart out in the movie, and then Rambo rips out the villain's heart at the very end. And I don't know, I thought I was really surprised with how much I enjoyed this movie, but I think that it's a well done movie, and I think, the politics of the Rambo movies are always a little bit awkward. I acknowledge that. Like there are political flaws with these movies. And this film coming out when it did, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's just, pro-Trump propaganda and going to just inflame the alt-right and make them hate Mexicans even more." This film, like the script was around before Trump got elected. And, the script like dates back to like 2009. So during the Obama years. Like, cartels were still a problem then. Cartels are a bad thing. If you act like the cartels aren't a thing, you're just not living in reality. And so, Stallone tries to pick real-world bad guys for Rambo to fight, and he thought, who's going to complain about him fighting the cartel? Because these are people who are selling people into sex trafficking and, smuggling drugs across the border. Who would be upset about Rambo killing those people? I understand, that the timing of the release might be awkward because people are saying, oh, Rambo's trying to paint all Mexicans in a bad light. But there are so many heroic Mexican characters in the movie, like the journalist that assists Rambo, Gabriella's aunt. The thing is, like, there's just a bunch of complex characters within this movie, and it's weird that a Rambo movie has this good of writing, but it does, and I think that ultimately, I think it has enough nuance and is reasonable enough where I would say that it overcomes the problematic elements that woke culture wants to attack. Like, unfortunately, woke culture tends to be overzealous and attacks everything, and becomes like the boy that cried wolf scenario, where like because they're attacking everything, it's made people stop taking woke culture as seriously, where there are legitimate things that need to be attacked and taken down, but I don't think that Rambo Last Blood is necessarily one of them. So I enjoy this movie. It's my number 2 for the year, which is a big surprise for me, but yeah, number 2 for 2019. So before I get to my number 1 film of 2019, I want to go through the list from the bottom to the top. So these are all the films that I've seen in 2019 that I can remember. Blinded by the Light, The Lion King, Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, Aladdin, The Lego Movie 2, the second part, Spider-Man Far From Home, Yesterday, The Dirt, Shazam, Pokemon Detective Pikachu, Captain Marvel, Dragon Ball Super Broly, Game of Thrones Season 8, Western Stars, Avengers Endgame, Joker, Rambo Last Blood. But my favorite film of 2019 is Frozen 2. For those of you who know me, you are definitely not surprised by this. For those of you who listen to the podcast weekly, hey, you notice how there were a bunch of Frozen episodes all in a row leading up to Frozen 2? And then we talked about it for an hour and a half about how much I liked the movie? Yeah, I still love the movie. It's the only film on this list that I have seen multiple times this year. That's not true. I have seen Dragon Ball Super Broly multiple times, but Frozen 2 is the only film that I've seen multiple times in theaters this year. So Frozen 2 is my second favorite film of all time after the reflection upon it. This is a movie that I think really understands its themes, what it's going for, and really understands its audience. I've seen so many YouTube comments of people saying, I was 12 when the first movie came out. Now I'm, an adult, and this movie, is giving me all the feels and, making me feel like it's okay to venture into adulthood. This movie is about, changing in seasons, changing in life, and it does such a good job with that. I talked about it at length in our Frozen 2 review, but I think, I've been reflecting upon this. There are movies, people's favorite movies might not be the best movie of all time, but it's the best movie for that person. And I think Frozen 1 and Frozen 2 are the best movies for me as an individual, especially for the time that they came out in my life. So, me seeing the original Frozen when I did really resonated with me as, struggling with societal acceptance, and that, sibling bond being at the core of the movie is just so relatable. And this film, coming out when it did, is so relatable, as I'm about to turn 30, of just accepting that, life has changed, venturing into the unknown can be a little bit scary, but you have to follow your calling. It's a really inspiring movie, it's an emotional movie, and the thing is, it took risks. This is a film that took risks, and they paid off. And this is showing that they cared about telling a good story. At the heart of this is they had a good story to tell. They waited until they had a good story to tell because, 6 years between children's films is a big gap. But they knew how great the original Frozen was, and they had to follow it up with something spectacular. And they succeeded. This is a spectacular film, one of my favorites, my second favorite of all time. I am so impressed with it. This film could have easily let me down. There, have been film series that I loved, and then the sequel let me down. Like Shrek 3 was a movie that I absolutely hated, and kind of ruined the Shrek franchise for me in a lot of ways. Frozen 2 had so much to live up to, but they took the time to craft a good story, and the heart and souls of the filmmakers are in this film. The song The Next Right Thing was inspired by, the grief that one of the directors faced when, after the release of the original Frozen, one of his children died. And, that grief and still moving forward and trying to do the next right thing in life and just not knowing where to go, but just trying to do the next right thing, is what inspired that song in Frozen 2. And to have the character of Anna sing it, the eternal optimist, like deal with such grief and heartache and still trying to move on, like the messages are phenomenal. You know, I was arguing with Caleb Swice today on Twitter, where he was saying, I was jokingly talking about how Frozen is, better than Tangled, and like that's just the hipster choice, somewhat jokingly. And he said, well, Tangled didn't just, throw away archetypes for the sake of throwing away archetypes. The thing is, Frozen and Frozen 2 understand archetypes, and they know when to invert them to make the message more powerful. But they're not just inverting them for the sake of throwing a gotcha on the audience. They're doing it to enhance the core emotional themes of the stories. And that's what they've been about. And so the writing is very clever, because you don't have to follow the Joseph Campbell archetype structure to a T, because otherwise every story would be the exact same thing. There's a reason why Taxi Driver is a very different film than Frozen. They just are. And the story that they tell, I think they tell excellently. And it just, like, the themes are powerful, the emotions are powerful. There might be some complaints about, the lore is too simplistic. It's not meant to be Lord of the Rings, where you need to read the Silmarillion to understand it. They told the story they wanted to tell, and told it excellently. And for the audience, this film was made for the audience of people who are really touched by Frozen 1, and have gone through changes in the last 6 years, and need, like, someone to tell them that, like, hey, change is okay. You'll get through it. Change is okay. And I think the film succeeds with that, and it's just my favorite film of 2019. I love it, and I hope that you will give it a shot. But yeah, so those are my film rankings for the year 2019 for the films that I saw this year, that came out this year. So I saw some other ones that old films that I just missed from previous years. That just this is about new films. This is about the stuff that came out this year. A year in review. What films did you see this year? Let me know in the comments below if you're watching or listening on YouTube. Give me your ranking below the films you saw this year. And tell me about which of my opinions you thought were most egregious. You can find me on Twitter at Greg Troyan, Tryan. The band is called Lipstick Generation. You can find us at lipstickgeneration.com and on all major streaming platforms. And the podcast is called The Lipstick Panel. It's found when you Google The Lipstick Panel. Then you're like, hey, I found it. That's what the podcast is. Well, that is our episode. Hopefully this was somewhat entertaining. It's much harder to do a solo podcast. But yeah, hopefully you guys didn't mind this. It kind of undermines the original premise of the show, where I just didn't want to be one random dude on the internet spouting his opinions about media. But, hey, the holidays, Steve's out of town, and, I don't know, I think it's a fun wrap-up, because I'm not usually a big movie guy, so to have seen this many movies in 1 year is kind of weird for me. So it's like, hey, let's talk about the movies. So, hopefully you enjoyed it. And, we'll be back with a regular episode next week. Peace.